Hello everyone, today we address the cultural impact of Justinian's reconquest in the western provinces. So the Justinian's reconquest came randomly to be one of the most discussed topics on Schwerpunkt. You will see that in the Byzantine history playlist, as it's we can say it's an overlooked moment in history because it's big enough and to have being covered, also to being received properly in popular culture along these patterns. But surely there are certain consequences of this that importantly revolve around the identities that were being formed properly in Europe and in Mediterranean, in in a pattern that we could say it's simply east and west in a sense. It's naturally also northern and southern by a certain degree, and probably the latter was the most important divide, especially from a cultural point of view, but not all, very broadly meant. But surely there is a more structural aspect, that is the cultural one, that indeed shows, interestingly, through culture, also important political and social dynamics. There is something about the Justinian's restoration that and Justinian's reign as an emperor altogether between 527 and 565, which is an astonishingly long period for not just for Roman imperial rulers standard, that indeed brings the historical imagination to make it dominate the 6th century. It was a big deal because in the eyes of the Romans and the rest of the world, this was properly the reaffirmation of an ecumenic order that naturally had essentially to restore pre-existing, asset. That at this point, however, and as we know, also because of later events and the same, I don't know, think about the pandemic that struck the world at that point, and with much more dramatic effects than today, given the fragility of the productive system, etc., seem to have brought to an end. Actually, when I speak culture about this topic in medieval history in general, I do sympathize generally with the Western perspective, not just because I fit a bit in the same in this narrower sense, but also because I feel properly the rupture of the ecumenical order is one of the major causes, right, of this same identity stance. When speak, however, of the so we can't read just history through that, right? But it's an interesting key of interpretation that I usually avail myself of. But when we speak properly, the necessity of the empire to reconquer the western provinces, I'm somewhat surprised to meet with the idea, well, they should have not done it, right? I've discussed this elsewhere, so I won't repeat myself, but properly, there wasn't anything, I would probably done the same thing, right? I can't say, that I know better, or that what I've said about these things brings me to be as competent as a Roman emperor of the 6th century. But properly, as from what we know, historically speaking, there was no reason, especially at that point with the renewal of Byzantine telesocracy, with an important moment of stability of the empire, recompaction, etc., of strengthening of the ideological control of the empire. This reacquisition, reintegration, reconquest, in fact, of especially the most productive Western Mediterranean lands would be wrong, right? Now you can't really say, for especially after COVID, like, no, these guys should have prevented a pandemic, right? It's ridiculous, as it's ridiculous to presume that there was any other way fundamentally to strengthen the empire at that point. Most of these systems were objectively tied to expansion. Yes, this expansion had a cost, but also our historical capacity of measuring how much the empire had been exhausted by this, and how eventually the shortcomings, the failures the decline, the very long one, by the way, that took later before the actual big crack of the mid 7th century with Islamic invasions, do not provide us with properly and even say, okay, this something wrong. They should have not done it, right? If anything, it tells us the exact contrary. And that's where the cultural dimension also is fascinating to see, because the word naturally contrasting wills, intentions, properly, even views of power, such as that, were struggling there. There was a conquest, was an invasion, right? Most of the Western Mediterranean lands that were conquered, reconquered, were de facto now not perceiving Constantinople as truly one of theirs, right? Most people, at least, wouldn't think like that. The elite that often controlled still most of the assets had properly were the rulers of those lands, believed otherwise. But also in here we're talking of not just a Roman, but properly a Romano-Germanic reality that, especially in the case of the Goths, both in Italy and Spain, but that same could be said for the Vandals in Africa, were naturally thinking otherwise, and most of the people, also for how events especially went, but this is clear, especially in the latter phase of the Ostrogothic, of the Gothic War in Italy, even clearer in the case of Spain, as we will see now, wouldn't, had different idea, different, opinion, we could say, properly worldview, how power should be properly held, and who had to do it. Surely they all lived in the wake of the empire. Nobody believed that imperial authority did not exist, or they wouldn't have to share. They were fundamentally obsessed with the same, right? But there is, aside from the ideology, there is a concrete dimension of rule that says who has to properly live of this land, and how organize it to develop it further, etc. And yes, the reconquest in especially in the Italian case was ruinous, right? And that was the biggest shot. I mean, what does have a Roman emperor to do in the 6th century? Of course, reconquering Rome. So that was the most important goal in absolute terms. Properly, even just from an ideological point of view, there was a strategic need to do it. That is to say, ideologies are necessary to rule an empire concretely, right? So here we are digressing a little bit, but to make the long story short, it's obvious that the imperial reconquest was of the former western part of the Roman Empire was essentially, it was about, ideally, the unification, right, of the imperial lands, and altogether the re-inclusion and the systematization, the reorganization of the same along this pattern, right? In my opinion, it was not a failure, right? Things could go better. And eventually other factors came to alter this achievement. But altogether, the thing was done. The thing was achieved. It was a reconquest. The Byzantines still maintained for a long time, the territories that they had conquered. So, in spite even of further things that happened specifically in the West, there was also, the Eastern threats that are not being conceived. There was even eventually in the 7th century, the long-awaited victory of Rome over the Persians that had already happened, actually. So probably it was not definitive at all, just because the Muslims eventually took over the same Sassanids. But the question is still about the overall success, right, of the Justinian order, right? That was not supposed by those time standards just to be a forever lasting thing, concretely, in spite of the idea of perpetua sancta and so on. It's obvious that later emperors would, screw things up a little bit more, a little bit less. Others would do good things, but in general, the reconquest was not a failure per se, right? And from a cultural point of view, there were, though, contradictory effects because of how this thing was carried out, with the consequences they brought to, right? So from a cultural point of view, this reconquest came to disrupt fundamentally certain changes that were in progress, that were already mirroring those different views of power and culture and identity that, at this point would see that properly the Byzantine one as a different thing. And this these consequences varied, right? They were different from country to country for this reason. One major, Justinian's restoration naturally was operating at a cultural level, because the cultural centers were the ones that would spread this, not just the ideology, but properly provide with, the clerks, the administrators, and so on. And also, in a way that was very different in Constantinople from already some Western centers. And there were, in fact, as cultural in the great capitals of the West. So we're talking about essentially Rome, Ravenna, and Carthage, right? They surely had more in common with the great centers of of learning in the East, just by connection, by the fact that these were still centers of Romanity in many ways. But they were already were on the path of taking other directions, and surely also these centers varied concretely in nature, right? They at this point they had succeeded in surviving as autonomous centers, providing their own view of the story. In 554, Justinian, on demand of Pope Vigilius, promulgated the Pragmatic Sanction, which, among various things of important, emergential important even in certain fashion, re-established, and this is very meaningful, the official salaries that had been traditionally paid to grammarians, orators, doctors, and lawyers, that in our republic, this is quoted from the original text, there should flourish young men instructed in liberal studies. Right. So this is a very elegant way to say that the, especially in certain regions after the war, the public education had collapsed, and that had to be reestablished. Public education wasn't, children going to school. Public education meant that there were certain specific centers of learning that had produced orators, figures of trust from a juridical management point of view that would support imperial policy on a territorial base. And naturally, these were properly conceived as centers of higher education, were properly provided with the infrastructures, the material, etc., that would practically school to which these people would be educated. But the problem in this whole is that especially in Italy, the situation had completely changed from properly what we call still as late antique reality, right? It was still, of course, transitioning in part, but in this region that had been fundamentally the most important and that where, in fact, the greatest resistance had been revived, not just from the Ostrogoths themselves, but properly from the Italian population, because there would have been simply demographically no way to support a resistance without the support of the people. And this is very well known if you think about figures like Totil, etc. All the problem of properly transforming the Roman colonists literally into Ostrogoths from a juridical point of view, with the promise of freedom, of complete freedom from the model of the latifundia that what the Byzantine reconquest, the same Roman senators in Italy would have liked to keep reinforced. The war had destroyed this. So as a consequence, the properly the structural base on which the city, the center of learning, with the late antique culture could properly even derive the cultural means of its self-perpetuation from an educational, ideological point of view, had been wiped out. Right, so the situation was really bad, because, as you know, Italy would remain can't say unstable, but eventually would be invaded by the Longobards, there was a major, even in that sense, a major, properly revolution against the same Byzantine control. Right, we know from the bishops, from also the Constantinople and Papal relations, that were literally people, Byzantine subjects, abandoning Byzantine's land to go live into the Longobard kingdom because they had it easier. Here it's a very important reality, but you have to understand that of course that is an important shift in properly in civilizational and cultural values. Right, you want something else. You want to live in a different way, and the reason being that, of course, what the empire would have liked to maintain in terms of socio-economical balance was not achievable anymore. Africa was reconquered as early as 533, and let's say it was a smaller system, a more compact one, even geographically speaking. You essentially have this greatly urbanized area that had partially declined, but along the coast, then you have an hinterland which is properly not much. So it's also easier to control in a way, in spite of the rebellions that would occur later on, the Berbers harassing the Roman communities and so on. But we can see here, perhaps for this greater controllability of the territory, of a resumption of a scholarly and literary life, right? That in a way, it's often said, the Vandals had fundamentally blocked cultural activity. This is also not true. This was believed up to a certain point. We speak for Africa, a sort of Vandal renaissance. At some point, we're surely at the moment of the conquest, a emigration to places like Sardinia, for example, that of the great African intellectuals. Africa was before the Vandal conquests, but one of the most advanced provinces of the empire. The Vandals had actually had some political troubles on their own, but there is no evidence properly of major scale persecutions. The dioceses, as far as we know, also archaeologically speaking, remain the same. Surely, like in Spain, for example, there were some substitutions of Arian priests with of the Catholic priests with the Arian ones, but to speak properly of a Vandal, an absence of cultural activity, of scholarly activity, also under Vandal times, is a bit bold. Surely, however, the representation of Roman rule was favored further teaching education. But even in here, lots of things had properly changed. The Vandalic kingdom had been destroyed properly, and that had received an important blow. Even if it kind of evaporated, like the Vandals were defeated very easily, but still this had changed after an important amount of time under Vandal control. Many things at the top, and this probably also in Roman Africa hadn't met with the approval of everybody. Around 550, the grammarian Flavius Cresconius Corippus in Africa praised in Virgilian hexameters the Byzantine victories of General John Troglodytes over the Berber invaders that were harassing, as we've seen, the province, which is properly the last Roman epic we have on a war theme, known as the Ioannid in that case. So, as you understand, this is also essentially like a courtly, it was the rhetorical flattery, the panegyricity, and so on, right? And were typical of late antiquity, but here, in a context of restoration, properly show even better the establishment of the old order, but in a way that was changed. The 6th century is an important period of change, in a way. Yes, a place like Africa would maintain actually probably longer this Roman character, but I think authors agree on the general decline, but which was evident. There were lots of rebellions there, even think about how Heraclius rose to power and so on. But by the time of the Islamic conquest, that land had yes, was not the same it had been previously. And the reconquest may have been a reason, because as you probably know, at least my regular followers know, I don't believe that the Western Empire even was doomed to fall. Right, there was nothing deterministic about that. It kind of happened randomly, especially in the last 10 years of the, because of the last 10 years of the of the Western part. But this Western, properly Latin world was provided with some very interesting characteristics. I mean, this especially lived on in Gaul, especially in southern Gaul, also in partly in Spain. Right, those were countries where properly there was never a crack with the Roman order, right? Unlike other lands, like Italy, for example. Also, Africa fits with this. But we don't know how it would have been if, let's say, I don't know, even if the Ostrogoths, for example, had remained in power, right? Because you have the same thing comparatively with the Visigoths, right? It wasn't easy because it was all the problem, especially in Italy, to get rid of this very Roman aristocracy that you couldn't really govern the country without, but was so close to Constantinople, would always try to get the Goths out, and that's how the mass of the Gothic War happened in the first place. As you will see now, in Spain things went differently, concretely. Right, and this happened in part also because the most Romanized lands, however, were reconquered by the Byzantines, and the rest of Spain was kind of not full late antiquity kind of society. Right, it was already something in between, already in the properly in the Romano-Germanic mindset in many ways. In fact, southern Spain was reconquered at some point that we don't even clearly know. It seems, because many people say 554, right, after Italy, but it seems like, for reading some sources better, it seems that Spain might have been conquered even before, right, between Africa and Italy, actually. And the Byzantines ruled in southern Spain up to 624, right? The Byzantine troops had occupied essentially this coastal strip of varying width that didn't quite develop culturally in the same way, for example, Africa did. These lands were historically the most advanced of the Iberian Peninsula. I mean, since ever. Because that's where the Carthaginians had settled, the Romans had dabbled. What had been Baetica was one of, together with Roman Africa, southern Gaul, western Anatolia, were some of the most dramatically Romanized lands in the whole empire, right? Because it was rich, fertile, had also historically precious metals that in the area, important mines. So the majority of wealth in Roman Spain had been concentrated there, specifically. At this point, lots of things had happened. In the meanwhile, certain lands had been also ravaged by the Vandals before they settled in Africa. You see, where you have to pass by, you just ravage. Where you have to settle, you actually do not have much of an interest of destroying what you're going to settle on. So, but properly, we don't find in Spain, after the Byzantine reconquest, anything like what we've seen, for example, with the long African Ioannide, but just 9 emphatic verses, which the Byzantine patrician Commenciolus had engraved around 589-90 on the walls of his capital city, Cartagena, which he had restored. It was normal, right? The patricians, they were basically subcontracted the same management of the cities. That's how so late antiquity had been a bit. So they had to sponsor the fact they were the ones who invested for the city, etc. But there is also a more recent identification which attributed to Bishop Severus of Malaga several cantos of a biblical epic that follows the ancient tradition of the Evangeliorum Libri of Juvencus. This is interesting because the latter discovery proves that the Hispano-Romans of Baetica, as men of frontier, so between the Visigothic kingdom and, we can say, the Mediterranean as a restored Roman lake at that point, of a Greek, right, at least Greek-speaking presence, who had come from a different political and cultural world. Right, hell, there was a dramatic divide, after all. Even culturally speaking, we've seen many times recently, we make some video about this, between the Constantinopolitan aristocracy and, for example, the Italian one, the Romano-Italic one. If anything, they spoke two different languages. That's not a and that is in the central Mediterranean. You can imagine a place like Baetica that is literally from the opposite end. How less would have properly even considered, Byzantine influence as something so familiar, after all. I don't want to say that Romanity, or properly the idea that to be in the empire was alien to these countries. That this would remain for a long time. Hell, even, Germanic peoples outside the empire at this point believed they were inside the Roman Empire. But still, it's very different to be in an empire in a decentralized position, as most of these aristocrats had up to that point enjoyed, in a sense, and to be properly ruled by a foreign presence, an armed one, by the way, of people who come from another country, from the other side of the Mediterranean. Like, always remember, this pan-Mediterraneanism, it's never been quite a thing, right? Mediterranean countries are much more diversified than, say, Northern European countries. And here we're talking about something more than identity properly meant. Always remember, this is about power. It's a struggle for control. Here, the most educated, so the most culturally productive, were properly the most powerful. This is the word that the older senatorial famous, the aristocracy, were the people who traditionally had ruled in these centers for a long time. So the moment somebody arrives with a garrison, with a body of officials, whatever, in your own city that you consider almost like your personal property at this point, by tradition, well, you start feeling challenged, right, at your status, and this does pass definitely also through culture, through struggle. I mean, all the political battles at this point at court were essentially a duel between rhetors in many ways. Were extremely subtle things, but behind that were big interests, were big families, were big assets, right? And remember, as we were saying before, that also that in Spain there hadn't been such a disruptive war there, so the latifundium had remained somewhat intact. Yes, of course, with a gradual contraction over the centuries, but nothing like in post-Gothic Italy. So the chronological coincidence between the last decades of Byzantine occupation and the appearance in an important city like Seville of literary works of Isidore makes one think even more about this. But you know that Isidore of Seville is one of, together with Gregory of Tours, with at this point also Cassiodorus had been, but it's one of the great voices of properly of the early Middle Ages, right? Isidore would write basically the standard Christian encyclopedia for all the Middle Ages, right, with his etymologies and so on. And we can definitely see how some Hispano-Romans of the south of the peninsula had surely gone to Constantinople, to the east, to be educated this was also still a thing, right? For example, John of Biclaro, he did around 558. Also Leander, in the 80s of the 6th century, he was the older brother of Isidore, and also he wrote an important amount of stuff, had actually supported, in fact, even Byzantine intervention against the Arian Visigoths. So cultural contexts with the East and in broader interests had surely remained in Spain. But there was a big game changer around the same period, famously enough, that was the definitive conversion to Catholicism of the, let's say, in fact, the Arian party in the Visigothic kingdom. And this would create, as we have seen also, for example, those videos about the councils of Toledo, etc., to the emulation, creation in Spain, especially, properly of an imperial ecumenic alternative to the Roman Empire. That is, they started essentially imitating Constantinople in everything, just like the councils of Toledo were mirroring the ones of Constantinople. There was a broader ambition of ecumenity that Spain would maintain, historically speaking, both under the Muslims and eventually after the reconquest. Properly considering the peninsula as a thing on its own. This in part also thanks to its isolation, but not only, because they properly believed in their uniqueness of their experience, and especially with the conversion of the Visigoths to Catholicism, even the need for these eminent figures, mostly bishops, because you know that the most important senatorial families essentially had transformed into episcopal ones in these Roman cities, to actually create any attrition with the Goths themselves. And it was obvious that at that point that essentially a Spanish would support the local power rather than one that would come from very far away. Not because they were integrated in the same system. Right, these were not like, I don't know, the Suebi that presumably were happy that the Byzantines had stripped, the Visigoths of those lands in the south. Here we're talking of Hispano-Romans that were properly framed within the Visigothic kingdom, and they were part of the elite, they were participating to the councils, being powerful, etc. So they properly had a political institutional role of power as landlords. Right, the history of the Visigothic monarchy basically is about also the victory of these privates over royal authority that by the time of the Islamic conquest had been reduced to a relatively poor thing. The councils took over. The councils were representatives of the nobility, of the Hispano-Roman Catholic nobility, the episcopal lords as the lay lords and so on. But that's another story, and for when we will talk about more in detail about the Visigothic kingdom again. In general, the inhabitants of Baetica changed ID, or at least were more likely to, after the Visigothic conversion to Catholicism, towards the Byzantines at that point. For example, Isidore, as we've seen, as the younger brother of Leander and as his successor as Bishop of Seville, in fact himself, didn't know much Greek, right? He was definitely pro-Gothic, didn't like the Byzantines much. In 624 he would in particular celebrate the expulsion of the last imperial soldiers from the Iberian Peninsula that he saw as a unity. That's interesting as a political and also ecclesiastical view. He properly distrusted Eastern Christianity as such. Like at the Council of Seville of 619, he had condemned a Syrian bishop as guilty of, quote, acephalous heresy. Here it's a reference to monophysitism, and that's part of what is often overlooked. That is, we mostly when we back the Byzantines saying, the true Romans, whatever, we think, oh, look at what the popes did in the Middle Ages, right? And that's mostly like as an anti, orthodox thinking did, and a different view, ecclesiological view, and so on. But you have to think that before the 11th century, actually, Western Europe was much more orthodox, in spite of the fact that it wasn't that dramatically culturally developed and so on. It didn't actually, the same Constantinople. Of course, the Byzantines were doing it, as you know, chiefly to maintain control of the Near Eastern and Egyptian provinces that were quite important, where this heresy has spread also in here for kind of intolerance towards the centralizing push of Constantinople. Later on would happen with iconoclasm once again, but indeed you see that sometimes even certain Arians, such as, the Longobards, actually backed in an orthodox sense the papacy in the early Middle Ages in front of these, what were openly heresies. Like, there was no ambiguity of considering that monophysitism or monothelitism were something insane. Right, what do you think, that Christ is schizophrenic? Like, of course, like, these are kind of weird things that couldn't find any logical, coherent, reasonable appreciation in a land that stood to the scriptures. So we have to understand Eastern Christianity for the problems it was facing at the time, but surely this didn't contribute to make a Byzantine presence much appreciated in the West. There are, however, inscriptions in that decorated Isidore of Sevilla's library, where he actually appreciated the great Christian doctor of the 3rd century, the Greek-speaking origin that had been condemned in 552 by a council of the East that Justinian had summoned. This is fascinating because you see here, Origen was definitely, not much of an orthodox figure. So Isidore should have not liked him particularly either. But it's obvious, and it's not even a linguistical discriminant, because Origen was definitely coming from a Hellenistic background, Hellenic-speaking one. But the problem here is that it was probably an contemporary Byzantine policy that Isidore hadn't seen with any sympathy whatsoever. So he could even support essentially an heretic, and a recognized heretic of 400 years before, just because Justinian had something to say against him, right? And that tells you how properly at that point in the Iberian Peninsula, also Byzantine presence wasn't very much liked either. And naturally, when Isidore surely knew something in Greek, right? He had surely translated certain technical manuals and theological florilegia, right? His work, however, and this was wanted, properly doesn't display, especially considering for a person that properly wrote about the etymologies of of creation properly, that nor grammatically, nor encyclopedically, or historically, or religiously, he expresses Greek terms, right? Even mediated. Of course, he wrote in Latin, but there could be, as in Latin do exist, certain Greek borrowings. Instead, no, right? This was a specific lexical choice, vocabulary choice that he that properly expressed in order to stress the separation, when not the competition of Hispanic culture with Justinian's time culture, literary production. This is important because it also tells you how, this happened a good half of a century after the death of Justinian, but how also impacting that worldview, that political, cultural, literary vision of Justinian had stuck, right, in intellectual environments, because it was properly received for what the empire there had claimed properly. This empire had claimed its lands back, and these lands were inhabited by people that didn't quite like the idea altogether, because they realized that it was essentially at that point a foreign invasion. Naturally, Isidore's work reflects the needs of the church of the Visigothic kingdom, but this is another story as well. But it surely overlaps with this. There is also, importantly, no kind of reaction of these terms in Gaul, where, as far as we know, Byzantine troops never set foot at this point. That is to say, in southern Gaul, like there were coastal cities that were remained fully Roman. They minted their coins with imperial faith and so on. For them, they lived within the empire, because those were dramatically Romanized centers that had also dramatically economical interest to keep, for example, the sea trade with Constantinople alive. So they had all the needs, etc. But the Byzantines didn't invade Gaul, which was probably actually contemplated. We made a video on the so-called Atlantic perspective, the Justinian reconquest, because probably more than the Goths or the Vandals, that after all were defeated relatively easily. I mean, even the Ostrogoths in Italy kind of revived because the Byzantines made a mess with their command of the peninsula, but it was relatively easy to defeat these countries. What probably the Byzantines feared the most, right, and if it hadn't been for the Longobards that for 200 years remained as a wedge in the middle, was actually for the Franks, that indeed would cause some trouble eventually, since the 9th century, for the late 8th century, for the Saint Constantinople, in the revival of their power. So southern Gaul was eligible. The coastal line is properly an area of the reconquest, but also at some point probably they didn't want to annoy too much the Franks, so probably they didn't have much more resources again after, especially the Italian mess, to send in southern Gaul. And after all, these communities were still basically Roman in the broader Mediterranean trade and so on. So there is no effect of this of interference, right? And however, there are also isolated cases that show indirectly the beneficial influence in southern Gaul of and not only in the whole Gaul at some point, of Latin schools that were reestablished of the in the capital, the future Byzantine Exarchate of northern Italy. This is another very important aspect, because Ravenna, that, as you know, was de facto the administrative capital of the West for a long time, was very connected to Cisalpine Gaul, where it technically laid, and also the rest of Central Europe, of Gaul, other areas, so much that the Cisalpine Venantius Fortunatus undertook the excellent studies which enabled him to display later in the service of Frankish courts of Thuringia and of Neustria. So essentially working at the service of Saint Franks, right? With a Latin culture, right? The Byzantines didn't make it to Ravenna. Wasn't part of the coastal lines of Italy that were remaining connected, even sometimes having a prevalent Greek-speaking population, like especially in the south, etc. No, this was the Italian hinterland. Those guys were Latin. They spoke Latin, and they properly were let being so, and therefore Ravenna became, albeit being essentially the Byzantine capital of peninsular Italy, also a cultural center for not just the spread of Byzantine culture, but more often, especially from a literary point of view, properly Latin one, reaching as far as the Merovingian courts. However, we should also point out that such a refined talent of an ancient poet like Venantius Fortunatus could boast was very rare, right, at the time, and that even rarer, however, it was in properly northern Gaul by the end of the 6th century. That is to say, here we have properly essentially a northern Italian that goes to northern Gaul and represents basically some of the highest cultural elements there, right? So this, never forget this dramatic cultural emanation that you find, especially from Rome. Rome was in all this an enormous and was very autonomous as a city, as you know, even under the namely Byzantine control. Think about the Anglo-Saxon conversion, all the management the Roman Church had in the broader process of evangelization of Europe, etc. This constant, massive wave of Latin culture from the south to the north that contribute to the development also of Western Europe, as we know, fundamentally. As a connection. And it's also, like, I must say, back in the day, I studied something about, I think it was for the codicology exams, etc., of the remains of late antique culture into sometimes even the 7th century. Like we have even, especially in Gaul, that was, as we've seen, the place where in southern Gaul that maintained most, kind of a unity, continuity with the Roman past by certain Western European standards. The presence still of maybe these were, I don't know, can't say particularly modest, but also not the highest aristocrats, but people that were involved in essentially now in the Merovingian system, in the rule, in the decentralized realities, in with these cities that still worked fundamentally with interesting, etc., that owned their own, what were called at the time, the private zootecule, right, as if manuscripts were living creatures that were stored almost like in a treasure, right? And these last mines of late antique education that remained, that died out, and that we can't unfortunately even track that much archaeologically, but famously enough, centers like the Lorraine Islands, beautiful place, one of the most my favorite places of vacations, by the way, Cap d'Antibes and so on, connected with the important cities of Provence, like, for example, Arles, etc., were some, possibly at this point, the most advanced, also monastic schools, because in those areas, bishops and monks were very interactive, with, unlike other areas in Europe. They produced some of the most refined Latin literature at that point, properly cultural life and so on. Also, when, and these things cannot be tracked easily, but just to make an example, I don't know, when the Longobards invaded Italy, but it's obvious that the Roman cities like Verona, Milan, Pavia, all these places were, we know, epigraphically speaking, there were aristocracies there, they were Roman, and they were the literate ones, the one habituated with administration, etc. If the Longobards could build the actually dramatically advanced administrative system that they did, and that nobody actually talks about in popular culture, in spite historiography from more than half a century has consolidated this acknowledgement, could work in the first place. But it was obviously because of these figures that helped the Germanic rulers to establish properly a territorial control on the basis of this rigorous administration, so that the kingdom could be politically and institutionally Germanic, without ambiguities, like they existed, for example, in Spain or Gaul at some levels, even in law and everything. But these people spoke Romance, right? They wrote in Latin, and there would be so much. I mean, the early Middle Ages are beautiful. As you know, I moved far ahead in time for my work, but I began with early Middle Ages, and they're literally like they tell so much about us, and they they're relatively easy to study because the sources are few, right? It's as if we still studied the ancient world by that scale of properly of available info. So these, as you understand, this cultural impact of the Byzantine reconquest is something that must be properly framed, right? An aspect that instead we can't blame the Byzantines too much, at least for the way they mismanaged the command for political reasons at some point between Belisarius and Narses, is the damage they brought to Italy, as we were saying before. So this war that went on from 536 to 555 was, the Ostrogothic kingdom was destroyed, as you know. Probably the cooperation between the Romans and the Goths would have not been easy because it was all an elite thing. That is, the majority of the people were fine with the Gothic presence that had finally given some stability. I mean, there's no doubt of the fact that Ostrogothic Italy was a much happier place than the one of the peninsula under the last emperors of Ravenna. But the same cause of the war, as we've explained countless times, is that the Romans were just basically, in terms of political power, those few senators that owned almost all the land, right? While the majority of the Italian population was like under them, right? And the Goths, when they arrived, they kind of adapted in a way, in the sense that most Goths were becoming now, from their freeman's background, to ever more subdued by the aristocracy, their own aristocracy, so that it was said that every Roman wanted to be a Goth, but like that every Goth wanted to be a Roman, in the sense that at least at a lower level, the Goths were technically the conquerors, and therefore the average Roman aimed at becoming like free in the measure the Gothic law more or less formally maintained. Whereas the truth, also the other one, is that the Goths wanted actually to be Romans in the elites, right? They wanted to become senators in their own regard, and that was something that the same Theodoric pursued in a way, because it's easier to control the stratified population. But as you know, there were many strains, because there was the more conservative and also Arian bloc that said, no, we don't have to be like this. We have to preserve the freedom, or at least, if not of all the Goths, because they were elite themselves, so they didn't give a damn, but at least of an anti-monarchic asset, because you know that the Goths with Alaric, and also in this wake Theodoric, had created the concept of monarchy, but by Germanic tradition that was something completely alien. So many Goths didn't like Theodoric themselves. But it was actually a very unstable situation. The Gothic War might have not happened in a sense, but surely there would have been problems, serious problems, like the ones that happened, for example, in Visigothic Spain, and also in Vandal Africa, by the way. They used to say there was the pro-Roman Catholic faction and pro-Germanic Arian faction. In all cases, the Roman Catholic one was to win, because it represented the majority of the population, properly of the profiles of the mentality, etc. So until that substratum was intact, this assimilation could not properly be stopped, but it would still bring to resistance to the most ultrancist faction. In the case of Italy, as we've seen, the Roman senators were much more like Constantinople is close by sea, right? So it's something that they knew they could be easily reintegrated in the empire. Well, they caused this mess, for which probably the Byzantines would have not stayed out anyway, even if internal struggle had started without the properly a call for intervention. It actually was asked by the same Goths, by the same branches of the Gothic monarchy that had been, they were already conflicting with each other. This is the problem. Nobody cared about the actual confession or the ethnic divide. They only cared about who had grip on what and how they could maintain that, and the problem is that here the two factors were so balanced, there was no other solution but a bloody one. And this, so Italy was probably razed to the ground, which is extraordinary because still the country maintained actually the highest per capita wealth, and properly this is also what increased it in a sense, because it means that by the destruction of the latifundia, a lot of wealth was redistributed in a sense, but still the first generations after the Gothic War were terrible, right? There was a lot of poverty, cities were in decline. So we're talking about 6th century Europe. We're not talking about, very florid times in the first place. But a dramatic consequence of the Italian disaster is that, for example, the Hispano-Romans of Visigothic Spain would actually produce much more in cultural terms than Italy would do for properly, we're talking non-Byzantine Italy would produce for a couple of centuries, which doesn't, we're speaking culturally, we're not necessarily speaking from, for example, from a state building point of view, right? The Visigoths were a bit like the Franks at some point. They had at some point that the presence of those latifundia had essentially created a sort of quasi-feudal system where everything was private. The raising of the latifundium in Italy was very beneficial to a centralized rule, to the rule from the cities, not from the countryside, for a literate elite, for a centralized kingdom that the Longobard one was. So it shouldn't be disregarded, because that's also a lot of things would emerge from that country culturally later on because of this, right? Whereas other countries turned sometimes in a mess. I mean, the Visigoths wouldn't stand the Saracen invasions, and altogether Spain was transformed essentially in a huge frontier for 700 years. But that's also another story. I mean, it's not just because of what happened with the Gothic War, without the Gothic War, right? But it's important to see in perspective, because part of that Visigothic culture actually would live on in Muslim Spain, right? Muslim Spain centers like Toledo, not surprising, were some of the most important European centers of culture under the Muslims, and where also the Italians, the French eventually withdrew from during the still 11th to 12th century with an important wave of culture at that point, because the Muslims were also bringing in all the Hellenistic, stuff that they had elaborated on their own, etc. Also, integrated with some Jewish, Indian, even other Persian type of culture that was very provoking, very enriching, intellectually. But it sometimes it does start from the early Middle Ages along these patterns. Italy definitely is, let's say, pre-Gothic War Italy is marked by two great figures, renowningly in the literary field of 6th century Europe, Boethius and Cassiodorus, right? Who were both actually very receptive of Greek as a language and a culture, because they were much closer to. It's not much a geographic thing. It's properly the fact that they were ultra elite, right? And they were at the highest levels of the Ostrogothic kingdom, and with the connections with the Saint Constantinople. People of enormous culture. Whereas, as we've seen recently, the Italo-Roman aristocracy altogether, some of the most ancient and noble Roman gentes, such as the Anici and the Simmaci, from which also these came from, were the exponents of the highest European culture at the time. Right, these families properly in the West, in the Italo-Roman reality, were the depositories of the actual Latin classical legacy, at levels of individual education that were not matched in any other place, nor in Europe, nor in the Mediterranean, but by no comparison of any kind. Constantinople didn't properly have anything like this. They had some kind of pre-packed, standardized forms of education for the bureaucratic career and political education, but these guys were probably families that passed down this enormous amount of knowledge. They were also sometimes kind of pagan sympathizers at some levels, but at least they had been. But were individually by far the most educated of all. The philosopher Anicius Malnius Torquatus Severinus Boethius left a work that made an enormous contribution to medieval culture. Right? He devoted 4 treatises to the 4 mathematical arts. He designated them for the first time by the term quadrivium. Right? Think about that, educationally speaking, what this meant for the Middle Ages and Western civilization. Because all medieval philosophy and some of the greatest accomplishments eventually came later through it, the modern age passed through this form of education. He undertook the translation of the work of Aristotle, recurring times, and this was interrupted brutally in 525 by his own execution by Theodoric. He managed to translate the statuaries works of logic, though. We owe so much in the West for this man. The result was that for this Aristotelian logic dominated Western thought for half of a millennium. Right? We saved that. Right? Because all the rest of Aristotle in the West came from the 12th century onwards via Arab translation. So the West, dramatic. It was mostly Platonic dominated, as you know, right? It basically was a Neoplatonic work in Neoplatonic culture, but based on the fathers of the church. Well, Aristotelian logic, thanks to Boethius, was for a much longer time assimilated in Western Europe. This process, as you understood, was destroyed by the Byzantine reconquest, in a sense, because albeit Boethius was essentially double crossing, he was he was from the side of those who wanted the Byzantine arrival, let's say. Still, the modalities in which this process was carried out and the survival of these individual scholars as a class properly, doesn't matter how numerous it was, but still highly qualitative, was cut. Right? I'm not entirely sure this altogether can be considered as a negative or positive thing, because eventually even what happened, as we were saying before with Italy, wasn't that bad as we think in insight, right? Eventually on the longer run, right? It may be that if the Byzantine reconquest had not arrived, we would have had a feudal Italy that would have not produced those centers of knowledge and sense of freedom and individuality of humanism that eventually the Middle Ages produced because of that pre-situation. So it's very difficult to tell, right? But we just can't say that the Byzantine conquest actually wiped out this same milieu that it was supposed to be helping. Boethius was famously condemned to death. He composed his masterpiece of philosophical prose and poetry in the Prosimetrum, properly entitled The Consolation of Philosophy, which is being considered as a testament of ancient wisdom. Right? These are the last true antique scholars that lived, and The Consolation of Philosophy is a rational work. Right, it's properly a man making sense of existence, considering the blessings of good fortune, on evil, on true good and happiness, and on providence and free will, because this is already a fully Christian reality. And so those are the last words that we get from that world specifically, and that's why these figures are so dramatically important. I would interrupt here because if we were to speak of the further developments specifically of the Italic reality, we will have to talk about Benedict of Nursia and Gregory the Great. But those figures fall already into a different reality of the post-Gothic war, one that was completely different. And I want to stress the importance of this break, because that changed everything in so many ways in the history of Western Europe. And we have to illustrate another time. I made some videos on Gregory the Great. Now that I think about it, it's pretty weird we never talked about Saint Benedict, the patron of Europe, and the founder of Western monasticism. But we will naturally have to make up for it. But there is something I made on Gregory the Great, specifically in, well, you will find it if you search on Schwerpunkt, like on YouTube, Schwerpunkt Gregory the Great, you'll find enough. There is one about the figure of Saint Aquistius and the work, this essentially literary creation of Gregory the Great, that was at that point making a huge work of civilization that the church naturally heralded, led, etc., all over Western Europe. This enormous Latin Germanic effort of reconstitution of education that took a long time but was dramatically successful, and as medieval civilization being a testament to that, which was starting from completely different bases from this late antique one that had been just being destroyed. It's as if approximately, and it doesn't mean anything, but the Middle Ages began there. And just think about being just, men like Gregory the Great, who, was properly part of the gens Anita, so some of that highest level of education, to properly realize with an incredible intelligence the new need to rebuild this world from bases that could be accessed also by the most humble, not just by the elite, the ultra elite that would rule over lots of dispossessed and uneducated masses, but somebody that had to make sense now in a world that is having received a trauma, an enormous blow. It's as if this society of ours now collapsed, and we had to find a new way to educate people about that. It requires an enormous existential responsibility. Well, these people did it in the Middle Ages. They had the capacity of doing it. Surely they lived in a world that was simpler, right? But not easier. And therefore we can understand so much of what it's needed for us to do something comparable. So we really stop here, and we will keep talking about this because there is really a lot, right? This is the same period in which also, for example, Irish missionaries began their work in the British Islands and eventually on the continent. And yeah, these are the great changers in our culture that were happening at the moment. When the world was so to the ground that whatever they changed was proportionally of enormous importance. If they hadn't been for these movements, doesn't matter sometimes how simple they were, but how intelligent they were. Really, we are lucky because of that. We wouldn't be the same ones we are today, and probably we would be for the worse otherwise, properly from a moral point of view. Anyhow, here we'll really stop, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.